They say trust is like a piece of paper. Once it's crumpled, it can never be perfect again. But what happens when you decide not to smooth it out, but to burn it? Instead, Julian St. James didn't scream or cry when he found out his wife was seeing her ex. He didn't hire a detective to chase them down. He did something much colder and much more dangerous. This is the story of my wife claimed Thursday coffee with her ex was harmless, so I hired a lawyer, not a detective. It's a battle between a wife who thought she could have it all and a husband who treats heartbreak like a business transaction. If you enjoy stories where logic becomes the ultimate weapon against betrayal, please hit subscribe and join our community. We explore the darker side of relationships every week. Now let's see how Julian balances the books.
The glowing numbers on the digital clock read 2:14 a.m., casting a sickly green hue across the master bedroom of the Back Bay penthouse. Beside him, Charlotte slept with the peaceful, rhythmic breathing of a woman who believed her secrets were safe, her hand loosely clutching the pillow where his head usually rested. Julian St. James wasn't sleeping. He was mentally calculating the timeline of his own destruction, staring at the notification phone. On that lit up the nightstand, coffee at Lumiere Thursday, is our day. It wasn't a question of if she was lying, but how much it would cost to cut her loose. If stories about the quiet, devastating moments before a marriage collapses resonate with you, where the silence is louder than any argument, stay with me. We are about to unravel a relationship, not with a scream, but with a signature. The rain in Boston had a way of making the city look like a watercolor painting, left out in the storm, blurred gray and weeping against the glass. Julian St. James stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of his corner office at Whitmore Capital, looking down at the ant-sized pedestrians scurrying along Federal Street. He wasn't looking at the people, though. He was looking at his watch. 10:14 a.m. She would be there by now. Charlotte had left the townhouse at 9:30 a.m. dressed in that camel-colored trench coat he had bought her in Paris, a silk scarf knotted loosely around her neck. She had kissed him on the cheek, a dry, perfunctory peck that felt less like affection and more like a toll paid to cross a bridge. "Just coffee, Jules," she had said, her voice airy, brushing past the tension in his jaw. "Derek is going through a rough patch with his gallery opening. It's strictly platonic. You know I love you. You know I love you." The phrase had become a punctuation mark, something she tacked onto the end of sentences to make the lies grammatically correct. Julian turned back to his desk. On the mahogany surface lay a single file folder. It wasn't a portfolio analysis or a merger proposal. It was a calendar printout from their shared iCloud account. Every Thursday for the last 8 weeks, a 2-hour block was grayed out, simply labeled C. Lumiere. Most men in his position would be scrolling through Yelp reviews of private investigators right now. They would want the grainy telephoto shots of hands touching across a bistro table or the timestamps of entry and exit from a boutique hotel. They would want to know exactly what happened during those 2 hours to justify their rage. But Julian was a quant. He dealt in macroeconomics, not microtransactions. He didn't need to know if they were sleeping together. He knew Charlotte. He knew that she wore her excitement like a second skin. For the last 2 months on Thursday evenings, she came home different, softer, more distant. She hummed songs he hadn't heard since college, songs Derek used to play on his guitar. The specifics of the betrayal didn't matter. The intent was the breach of contract. He picked up his phone. He didn't dial the number for Beacon Hill Investigations. He dialed a number he had saved under a false contact name, M.Y. Consulting. "Michelle Young's office." A crisp voice answered on the second ring. "This is Julian St. James," he said, his voice steady, devoid of the tremor that was currently vibrating in his chest. I need an appointment. Today. Mr. St. James. The receptionist paused, the clicking of a keyboard audible in the background. Michelle is in court until noon. She has a slot at 2 p.m. Is this regarding the estate planning? No, Julian said, watching a raindrop race down the window pane, consuming smaller drops in its path until it crashed into the sill. Tell her I'm triggering the sunset clause. Tell her I don't want a detective. I want a scorched earth strategy. There was a brief silence on the other end, the kind of professional pause that acknowledged a tragedy without offering sympathy. I'll see you at 2 p.m., Mr. St. James. Julian hung up. He looked at the calendar again, 10:18 a.m. Charlotte was likely sipping an oat milk latte right now, laughing at one of Derek's brooding artistic jokes, feeling the thrill of emotional infidelity, secure in the belief that her husband was just a busy banker, buried in spreadsheets. She thought she was the protagonist of a romantic drama torn between two lovers. She didn't realize she was actually the defendant in a case that had already begun. Julian sat down and opened his email. He had work to do. If he was going to dismantle his life, he needed to make sure his portfolio was balanced first. The Sterling building was a monolith of glass and steel that pierced the Boston skyline, a fitting fortress for Michelle Young. Her office on the 42nd floor smelled of expensive leather and fear, mostly the fear of the spouses sitting opposite her. Julian sat in a low-slung Eames chair, his hands clasped tightly in his lap to stop them from shaking. He wasn't shaking from nervousness. He was shaking from the adrenaline of finally saying the words out loud. She calls it closure, Julian said, his voice flat. Every Thursday, for 2 months. Michelle Young didn't look up from the file Julian had slid across her desk. She was a woman of sharp angles, a sharp bob, a sharp nose, and an intellect that could eviscerate a witness in 30 seconds. She flipped through the calendar printouts, her eyes scanning the dates with the detachment of a surgeon looking at an X-ray. Closure is just a polite word for keeping a door unlocked, Mr. St. James, Michelle said, finally looking up. She took off her reading glasses and set them on the desk. You didn't hire a PI. I don't need pictures of them kissing to know my marriage is over, Julian replied. I need to know where I stand with the contract. Michelle opened the thick leather binder containing his prenuptial agreement. She turned to page 34 with practiced ease. Julian remembered signing this document 7 years ago, back when he thought it was just a formality to appease his father. He never thought he'd be praying for its clauses to hold up. Here's the situation. Michelle began tapping a manicured fingernail on a paragraph highlighted in yellow. You are approaching the 7-year vesting cliff. According to Article 6, if you remain married for 7 full years, the infidelity penalty in the prenup softens. Currently, if we prove she has been unfaithful, she walks away with a capped settlement. Very modest. But... She paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the air. But, Julian pressed, if you cross the 7-year mark, which is exactly 22 days from now, the penalty expires. The assets become commingled regardless of fault. She could claim 50% of the Whitmore partnership interests. Julian felt the blood drain from his face. 22 days. 3 more Thursdays. So I file today, Julian said, reaching for his pen. We serve her tonight. No, Michelle snapped, her voice cracking like a whip. If you serve her today with nothing but a suspicion and a calendar printout, she will deny it. She will say they are just friends. She will claim you are controlling and paranoid. Judges in Massachusetts don't like controlling husbands. She will drag this out past the 3-week mark, and you will lose millions. Julian stared at her. So what are you suggesting, that I go home and ask her how the coffee was? I am suggesting you do exactly that, Michelle said, leaning forward. We need leverage. We need to document the alienation of affection. We need to prove that these Thursday meetings are the cause of the marital breakdown, not just a symptom. I need you to be the perfect husband for 3 more weeks. I need you to be so understanding, so patient, that when we drop the hammer, she looks like a monster, and you look like a saint. Julian stood up and walked to the window. The city looked gray and hostile below. He imagined Charlotte right now maybe texting Derek, maybe smiling at her phone in that secret way she thought he didn't notice. The thought of going home and cooking dinner, of sleeping in the same bed, of pretending he didn't know she was emotionally stripping him for parts, made him feel physically ill. I don't know if I can do that, Julian whispered. You are an investment banker, Julian, Michelle said, her voice softening just a fraction, though her eyes remained cold. You understand risk versus reward. The cost of your pride right now is roughly $12 million. Can you swallow your pride for 3 weeks to save $12 million? Julian looked at his reflection in the glass. He looked tired. He looked older than 35. But mostly, he looked like a man who was done losing. He turned back to Michelle. Draft the papers, Julian said. I'll give you your 3 weeks. Michelle nodded, a predator acknowledging a fellow hunter. Good. Then let's talk about next Thursday. I want you to encourage her to go.
Hold on, let me pause here for a moment. This is exactly where Julian changes the game. Most people would be losing their minds right now, screaming or throwing things. But Julian, he flips a switch. He stops being a heartbroken husband and starts acting like an investment banker protecting his assets. It is terrifyingly calm, isn't it? He is willing to suffer in silence for 3 whole weeks just to secure that $14 million payout.
Thursday arrived with the suffocating humidity that sometimes blanketed Boston in late spring, making the air feel heavy and hard to breathe. Inside the penthouse, the climate control was set to a crisp 68 degrees, but Julian felt sweat trickling down his spine as he watched Charlotte apply her lipstick in the hallway mirror. It was a shade of red she usually reserved for galas or their anniversary dinners. Rouge d'Enfer. The name felt appropriate. I might be a little late tonight, Charlotte said, pressing her lips together to set the color. She caught his eye in the reflection and offered a tight, apologetic smile. Derek is having a crisis with the gallery lease. He needs someone to look over the fine print. Julian leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed. He was wearing his casual cashmere sweater, the picture of a relaxed, supportive husband. Inside, his stomach was twisting into a complex knot of rage and nausea. It's fine, Char, Julian said, his voice steady, practiced. You're a good friend to him. Go, help him out. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. Michelle Young's instructions echoed in his head. Encourage her. Make her feel safe. Give her enough rope. Charlotte turned, surprised by his easy acceptance. For a second, a flicker of guilt crossed her face, or perhaps it was just relief. She walked over and brushed a piece of lint off his shoulder. The scent of her perfume hit him, jasmine and sandalwood. It was the scent she had worn on their first date. Now she was wearing it for a coffee meeting with an ex-boyfriend on a rainy Thursday night. You're the best, she whispered. Don't wait up. The lock clicked. The heavy oak door swung shut. The silence that followed was instant and deafening. Julian didn't move for a full minute. He stared at the wood grain of the door, imagining her walking down the hallway, stepping into the elevator, checking her reflection one last time before the doors opened to the lobby. He imagined the cab ride to the South End, the anticipation building in her chest, the way her hand would tremble slightly when she saw Derek waiting at their table. He pushed off the doorframe and walked into the kitchen. He needed to do something with his hands before he put a fist through the drywall. He began to cook. It was a masochistic ritual he had developed over the last few weeks. He would prepare an elaborate meal, something that required focused timing and precision, knowing she wouldn't be hungry when she came home. Tonight, it was saffron risotto. He chopped the shallots with surgical precision. Chop, chop, chop. The knife hit the cutting board with a rhythmic violence. He visualized the timeline Michelle had laid out. 21 days remaining. 3 more Thursdays. 3 more nights of standing in this kitchen, pretending he didn't know that his wife was likely touching another man's hand across a candlelit table right now. He threw the shallots into the pan. The butter hissed. Julian stirred the rice, watching the grains turn translucent. He wondered what they talked about. Did she complain about him? Did she tell Derek that Julian was too cold, too focused on work, too analytical? Did she tell him that she felt lonely in this glass tower? Or did they not talk about him at all? That was the worst thought, that he was already so obsolete in her world that he didn't even warrant a conversation. He added a ladle of wine. The steam rose up, smelling of grapes and alcohol. He wasn't cooking for her. He was cooking to prove to himself that he could still create something, that he was still in control of the elements. If he could control the heat, the liquid, the texture of the rice, maybe he could control the disintegration of his life. The clock on the microwave read 8:45 p.m. They had been together for an hour now. Julian stirred. The risotto was creamy, golden, perfect. It was a dish meant to be shared, meant to be eaten with laughter and a bottle of white wine. He turned off the stove. He took the heavy pan and scraped the entire contents into the trash compactor. He watched the golden rice disappear into the dark void of the bin. He pressed the button. The machine whirred and crushed the food into a compact, unrecognizable block. Julian washed the pan, dried it, and hung it back on the rack. The kitchen was spotless. There was no evidence of the effort, no evidence of the care. Just a cold, clean surface waiting for a lie to walk through the front door. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and went to the living room to wait. The key turned in the lock at 10:48 p.m. Julian didn't look up from his iPad immediately. He kept his eyes fixed on the screen, scrolling through a market analysis he hadn't absorbed a single word of for the last hour. He needed to calibrate his expression. Neutral, mildly tired, vaguely interested. The door opened, bringing with it a gust of cool, damp hallway air and the click-clack of Charlotte's heels on the marble foyer. "I'm back," she called out. Her voice had a lilt to it, a lightness that hadn't been there when she left. It was the sound of a woman who had just been recharged. Julian set the tablet down on the coffee table and stood up. "Hey, you're late." Charlotte walked into the living room, shedding her trench coat. Her cheeks were flushed, a high spicot color that contrasted with the pale composure she usually wore. Her hair, usually pinned back in a severe professional chignon, was looser now, strands escaping to frame her face. She looked beautiful. She looked guilty. "I know, I'm so sorry," she sighed, dropping onto the sofa and kicking off her heels. She rubbed her temples theatrically. Derek was a mess. Absolute disaster. The landlord is threatening to triple the rent on the gallery space, and he needed someone to talk him off the ledge. You know how dramatic he gets. Julian walked over to the wet bar. "Drink?" "God, yes. Red wine, big glass." And he poured the wine, his back to her. He could hear the rustle of her dress as she settled in. "Did you manage to calm him down?" "Eventually," she said, accepting the glass from him. She took a long sip, closing her eyes. We just went through the contract line by line. It was tedious, honestly. Just hours of staring at paperwork and drinking stale coffee. Tedious. Julian looked at her flushed skin, the slight swelling of her lips. She didn't look like someone who had been reading legal jargon for 3 hours. She looked like someone who had been laughed with, listened to, and adored. He sat down in the armchair opposite her, crossing his legs. This was the moment. The test. "I'm sorry you had to deal with that," Julian said, his voice smooth. "At least the atmosphere at Lumiere is nice. Did you manage to say hello to Jean-Luc? I need to email him about hosting the firm's holiday party there." Charlotte didn't hesitate. The lie came out as easily as a breath. "Oh, yes." She nodded, swirling the wine in her glass. "He stopped by the table. He actually asked about you. Said he hasn't seen us in a while. He was wearing that ridiculous velvet blazer he loves." Julian nodded slowly, taking a sip of his whiskey to hide the grim smile threatening to break through. "That sounds like Jean-Luc," Julian said. "Always the showman." "Exactly." Charlotte smiled, relaxing into the cushions, thinking she was safe, thinking she had covered her tracks with a pleasant detail. But Jean-Luc didn't work at Lumiere anymore. Jean-Luc had suffered a stroke 3 weeks ago. He was currently in a rehabilitation center in Vermont, learning how to speak again. The new manager was a 20-something woman named Chloe. If Charlotte had been at Lumiere, she would have known that. If she had even looked at the staff, she would have known that. She hadn't been at the CAF. Or if she was so wrapped up in Derek Stone that the world around her had ceased to exist. "Well," Julian said, standing up, "I'm glad you had a productive evening. Are you coming to bed?" She asked, her eyes soft, full of the counterfeit affection she used to pay her rent in his life. "In a bit," Julian said. "I have a few emails to finish. You go ahead." He watched her walk down the hallway, the wine glass in her hand. She thought she had won. She thought she was the clever wife managing a boring husband. Julian waited until the bedroom door clicked shut. Then he picked up his phone and opened the Notes app. He typed a single line under the heading to evidence log date May 12th. Subject claims interaction with Jean-Luc at Lumiere. Jean-Luc is incapacitated. Lie confirmed. He wasn't paranoid anymore. He was vindicated. And in 18 days, when the prenup clause expired, that lie about a velvet blazer was going to cost her everything.
Okay, my heart is actually racing right now. The way she lied about Jean-Luc right to his face, that is chilling. But Julian's reaction is even colder. He doesn't call her out. He lets her lie. He lets her feel safe. It's like watching a spider spin a web knowing the fly has already walked into it. Every lie she tells isn't just hurting him anymore. It's becoming evidence against her.
The annual trustees' gala at the Metropolitan Gallery was the kind of event where the champagne was vintage, the smiles were fixed, and the air was thin with judgment. For Julian, it was usually just another networking obligation, a night to shake hands with clients and donors. Tonight, however, it felt like entering a cage match without a weapon. Charlotte was in her element. As one of the junior curators helping to organize the event, she was radiant in an emerald silk gown that clung to her frame, moving through the crowd with the grace of a diplomat. Julian trailed half a step behind her, playing the role he had perfected, the stoic, successful husband holding the purse strings. "You look tense," Charlotte whispered, squeezing his arm as they navigated through a sea of tuxedos. "Relax, Jules. It's just a party." "I'm fine," Julian lied, adjusting his cufflinks. "Just a long week." Then he saw him. Derek Stone stood near the abstract expressionist exhibit, holding a glass of cheap red wine like it was a prop. He was wearing a suit that didn't quite fit the fabric straining across his shoulders. His tie knotted loosely in a way that screamed tortured artist. He looked out of place among the hedge fund managers and legacy heirs, yet he possessed a gravitational pull that Julian recognized immediately. "Oh, there's Derek." Charlotte's voice pitched up, breathless. She didn't wait for Julian's response. She steered them toward him with an eagerness that was almost indecent. Julian felt a cold numbness spread through his chest. He had to shake this man's hand. He had to look into the eyes of the man who was listening to his wife's complaints every Thursday, the man who knew what she looked like when she let her guard down. "Derek, you made it!" Charlotte beamed, stopping just inside his personal space. Derek turned, his face lighting up with a familiarity that ignored Julian entirely for the first 3 seconds. "Wouldn't miss it, Char. The lighting in here is actually decent for once." Char. Julian stepped forward, forcing his presence into the equation. "Derek, good to see you." He extended his hand. It was the hardest physical action he had ever taken. Derek took it. His grip was firm, callous, warm. "Julian, good to see you, man. Charlotte tells me you've been working like a dog lately." The audacity of it nearly made Julian laugh. "Charlotte tells me." It was a subtle power play, a way of marking territory. "I know things about your marriage that you don't talk about." "Market waits for no one," Julian replied, his voice a flat line. "And how is the gallery situation? Charlotte mentioned you were having lease issues." Derek's eyes flickered to Charlotte for a fraction of a second, a micro-expression of shared panic. "Oh yeah, it's a headache. But Charlotte gave me some great advice. She's a lifesaver, really." "She is," Julian agreed, watching the way they stood. Their bodies were angled toward each other, creating a closed circle that Julian was technically outside of, even though he was standing right there. The leak wasn't a rumor or a scandal. It was the energy between them. It was porous and obvious. Julian looked around the room. Did anyone else see it? The way Charlotte touched her necklace when Derek spoke. The way Derek tracked her movement when she turned to greet a donor. To the casual observer, they were just old friends. To Julian, who had spent 7 years memorizing his wife's body language, they were screaming their infidelity. "I'm going to grab another drink," Julian said, needing to break the circuit before he vomited. "Get me a refill," Charlotte asked, holding out her empty glass without looking away from Derek. "Of course." Julian walked to the bar, the crystal glass heavy in his hand. He watched them from across the room. He saw Derek lean in and whisper something. He saw Charlotte throw her head back and laugh, a genuine, open-mouthed laugh that Julian hadn't earned in months. He realized then that Michelle Young was wrong about one thing. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about dignity. He took out his phone and checked the countdown app he had installed. 14 days. He would let them have their laugh tonight. He would let them think they were getting away with it in plain sight. Because in 2 weeks, the bill for this evening and every Thursday night coffee was going to come due, and Julian was going to make sure Derek Stone couldn't afford to pay it. The numbers on the spreadsheet were black and white, but to Julian they looked like blood spatter. He sat in his home office, the only light coming from the glowing monitors and the city skyline outside. It was 3 days before their 7th anniversary. 3 days before the vesting cliff, defined in their prenuptial agreement. The asset in question was his equity stake in Whitmore Capital. It wasn't just money. It was his identity. It was 18-hour days, missed holidays, and ulcers. If he dissolved the marriage before midnight on May 28th, Charlotte would be entitled to half of the appreciation value. That sum was approximately $14 million. If he waited until May 29th, the asset remained his sole property. $14 million. That was the price tag he had placed on his own suffering. He had endured the Thursday nights, the lies about Jean-Luc, and the public humiliation at the gala, all to reach this date. A soft knock on the door broke his concentration. "Jules." Charlotte pushed the door open, holding 2 mugs of tea. She was wearing his old university t-shirt, her legs bare. It was a domestic image that months ago would have made him close his laptop and pull her onto his lap. Now it just looked like a trap. "I brought you some chamomile," she said, setting the mug on a coaster. She moved behind his chair, wrapping her arms around his neck, resting her chin on his shoulder. "You've been in here all night." "Closing a deal," Julian said, his muscles tensing involuntarily under her touch. He minimized the spreadsheet, replacing it with a generic market news feed. "It's complicated." "It's always complicated," she teased, kissing his cheek. "But I was thinking, since the anniversary is this weekend, maybe we could just drive up to the Berkshires. I found this adorable inn. No cell service. Just us." Julian stared at the screen. No cell service. Just him and the woman who was cheating on him, trapped in a room for 48 hours while he waited for the clock to run out. "I can't," he said too quickly. Charlotte pulled back her arms, unraveling from his neck. "You can't, Julian. It's our 7th anniversary. The copper anniversary. Or wool. I forget which one, but it's a big one." "It's wool," he corrected automatically. "And I know it's big. But this deal, it's closing on Monday. I can't be out of pocket this weekend. I need to be here for the final signatures." He spun his chair around to face her. She looked hurt. Her eyes, usually so bright when she was spinning, her lies were now clouded with a genuine confusion that made his stomach turn. This was the paradox. She could betray him with Derek Stone on Thursday, but feel neglected by her husband on Sunday. She wanted both. She wanted the thrill of the affair and the safety of the marriage. "We haven't spent a real weekend together in months," Charlotte said, crossing her arms. "I feel like I'm living with a ghost, Julian." The irony almost made him snap. He felt the anger rising in his throat, a hot, acidic wave. He wanted to grab her shoulders and shake her. He wanted to scream, "I'm a ghost. Because you killed me. You killed us in a cafe with a man who can't even pay his own rent." He gripped the armrests of his chair so hard, his knuckles turned white. He took a breath. He looked at the calendar on the wall. 3 days. "I'm sorry," Julian said, his voice dropping to a low, defeated register. It wasn't acting anymore. He was exhausted. "I promise, Char, after this weekend, everything will be different. We'll resolve everything." Charlotte softened. She heard a promise of reconciliation where he had meant a promise of termination. "Okay," she sighed, stepping forward and running a hand through his hair. "Next weekend, then. But I'm booking the best restaurant in town for Tuesday night. No excuses." "Tuesday," Julian repeated. "That sounds perfect." Tuesday was the day after the serve date. She kissed his forehead and turned to leave. "Don't stay up too late. You need your rest for this big deal." "I will," he said. He watched her leave the door, clicking shut behind her. The silence rushed back in heavy and cold. Julian turned back to his screens. He opened the folder labeled Project Sunset. The draft for the divorce petition was already there, prepared by Michelle Young. The date on the header was blank. Julian typed in the date, May 29th. He wasn't just saving his money. He was buying his freedom. But as he looked at the empty mug of tea she had left him, a small act of kindness from a woman who was stabbing him in the back, he realized that saving the $14 million was going to feel exactly like losing everything. May 29th dawned with a sky so blue it looked artificial, the kind of aggressive spring cheerfulness that felt mocking. For Julian St. James, however, the weather was irrelevant. The only climate that mattered was the legal one. As of midnight, the vesting period had passed. The Whitmore partnership equity was securely, irrevocably his sole property. The 7-year itch had been scratched with a contract. That evening the penthouse was quiet. Charlotte had insisted on a quiet night in to celebrate just the two of them, a bottle of 2005 Bordeaux and the skyline view. She had dressed for the occasion in a cream cashmere dress that fell softly against her curves, looking every inch the devoted wife she believed she was playing. "To us," she said, raising her glass. The crystal chimed against his. 7 years. The wool anniversary. Julian took a sip. The wine was excellent, earthy complex, and tasting faintly of victory. "To 7 years," he echoed. He didn't add, "and not a day more." "I have something for you," Charlotte said, her eyes shining with a genuine warmth that made Julian's stomach tighten. She reached under the table and produced a small rectangular box wrapped in silver paper. Julian took it. He unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a scarf hand-knitted from soft gray alpaca wool. It was imperfecta, dropped stitch here and there, which meant she had made it herself. She must have spent hours on it, likely while he was at the office late, or perhaps she knitted it while waiting for Derek to finish a call. "It's beautiful," Julian said, placing it on the table. "Thank you." "I wanted to make something," she said softly. "To show you that I know I've been distracted lately, with the gallery with friends. But I'm here, Jules. I'm 100% here." The doorbell rang. It was a sharp, intrusive sound that cut through the jazz playing softly on the speakers. Charlotte frowned, glancing at the clock. It was 8:15 p.m. "Are we expecting someone?" she asked. Then her face brightened. "Oh, did you order dessert? Is that your surprise?" Julian didn't move. He stayed seated, his hand resting near the stem of his wine glass. He looked at her, really looked at her, memorizing the hope in her eyes, before he extinguished it. "You should get that," Julian said calmly. Charlotte stood up, her dress swishing, as she walked to the foyer. Julian swirled the wine in his glass. He heard the heavy front door open. He heard the murmur of a deep male voice. "Charlotte St. James?" the voice asked. "Yes." Charlotte's voice was confused, light. "I have a delivery for you. Sign here, please." Julian heard the scratch of a stylus on a digital pad, then the rustle of paper, a thick, heavy envelope being passed from one hand to another. "Thank you, ma'am. Have a good evening." The door closed. Silence returned to the hallway, but it was different now. It was the silence of a vacuum sucking the oxygen out of the room. Charlotte walked back into the dining room. She was holding the large manila envelope. The return address in the top left corner was stamped in bold black ink, the law offices of Michelle Young. She stopped at the edge of the table. Her hands were trembling. She looked at the envelope, then at Julian. He hadn't moved. He hadn't looked away. "Julian," she whispered. "What is this?" "It's the surprise," Julian said. His voice was devoid of anger, devoid of love. It was the voice he used for firing underperforming analysts. Charlotte tore the tab. She pulled out the stack of documents. The cover page was standard brutal legalese. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Plaintiff Julian St. James. Defendant Charlotte Hayes St. James. She stared at the words as if they were written in a foreign language. She read the first paragraph, then the second. Her eyes widened, darting back and forth. Divorce! She choked out the word, fracturing in the air. Julian, what? Why, we just toasted. I don't understand. Check the date, Charlotte, Julian said, gesturing vaguely to the papers with his wineglass. It was filed this morning, May 29th. She looked at him, tears pooling rapidly in her eyes, spilling over onto her cheeks. But why is this about the gallery? Is this about me being busy? We can talk about this. You don't just serve someone papers on their anniversary. I do, Julian said. He stood up then, towering over the table, over the hand-knitted scarf, over the ruin of their life. When I know that for the last 2 months, you've been spending every Thursday night with Derek Stone. The color drained from her face so fast, she looked like a statue. The denial died in her throat before it could even be born. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. I didn't hire a detective, Charlotte. Julian continued, walking around the table until he was standing right in front of her. I hired a lawyer. I waited for the clock to run out on the partnership clause. And now I'm done waiting. He reached out and gently took the envelope from her frozen hands and placed it on the table next to the scarf. Happy anniversary, he said. The silence in the penthouse was no longer the comfortable quiet of a shared life. It was the desolate silence of a courtroom after the verdict has been read. Charlotte sank into the dining chair, the heavy manila envelope spilling its contents across the mahogany table. The pages were crisp white and indifferent. She looked at Julian, her eyes searching for the husband who had cooked her risotto 3 weeks ago, man who had encouraged her to go out, the man who had let her kiss him goodbye. He wasn't there. In his place stood a stranger in a bespoke suit, watching her with the detachment of an actuary assessing a natural disaster. You knew, she whispered, her voice trembling. You knew the whole time. Since the first Thursday, Julian corrected gently. Since you started checking your reflection in the hallway mirror differently. Since you changed your passcode. Since you told me you saw Jean-Luc at Lumiere. Charlotte flinched as if he had struck her. Jean-Luc? He had a stroke, Charlotte. He hasn't been at the cafe in a month. But you didn't know that because you weren't at the cafe. You were with him. Tears began to spill, now hot and fast, tracking through the powder on her cheeks. She reached out her hand, hovering over the paperwork, as if touching it would burn her. It wasn't what you think, she stammered, falling into the desperate, predictable script of the guilty. It was just talking, Julian. He was lost. I was just trying to help him. I didn't sleep with him, I swear. Julian poured the rest of the Bordeaux into his glass. He didn't believe her, but more importantly, he didn't care. The distinction between emotional and physical infidelity was a line drawn by people who still had hope. Julian had none. It doesn't matter, Julian said. You gave him your time, you gave him your loyalty, and tonight, you gave me a scarf while thinking about him. Charlotte looked down at the gray wool scarf on the table. It looked pathetic now, a limp gray thing sitting next to the legal summons. But why wait? She asked, her voice gaining a sudden sharp edge of realization. She looked at the date on the filing again. May 29th. Then she looked at him, horror dawning in her eyes. You waited for the anniversary. You waited for the vesting period. She stood up the chair, scraping violently against the floor. You sat there for 3 weeks, pretending everything was fine, letting me sleep in our bed, letting me plan a trip, all to save your equity. You calculated this, you monster. I am an investment banker, Charlotte, Julian said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. My job is to mitigate loss. You made a choice to invest in Derek Stone. I made a choice to divest from you. He walked over to the table and pulled a fountain pen from his pocket. He uncapped it and set it down next to the signature line on the decree of dissolution. "You can contest it," Julian said. "You can hire a lawyer. But Michelle has the logs, the texts, the dates, and since we passed the 7-year mark by exactly 20 hours, the prenup stands firm. You get the apartment in Back Bay and the Audi. I keep the firm. I keep my life." Charlotte looked at him, and for the first time Julian saw the fear. Not the fear of being caught, but the fear of the man she had married. She realized she had underestimated him. She had thought him boring, safe, predictable. She hadn't realized that his predictability was a fortress. She picked up the pen. Her hand shook so violently that the ink bled into the paper before she even started writing. She sobbed a raw, ugly sound that echoed off the high ceilings. Julian watched as she signed her name. A single tear fell from her lash, landing on the paper. Right next to her signature, blooming into a dark, wet circle on the white page. It was the only genuine thing she had given him in months. He picked up the papers. He didn't feel happy. He didn't feel relieved. He felt a vast, echoing emptiness, a hollow victory that tasted like ash and expensive wine. He had saved his fortune, but the house was cold. He looked at her one last time, a beautiful weeping woman in a cream dress, ruined by her own choices and his retribution. "How could you be so cold?" she wept. "I thought you loved me." Julian turned toward the door, the file tucked securely under his arm. He paused his hand on the light switch. "I didn't need a detective to tell me you were lying, Charlotte," he said, his voice final. "I just needed a lawyer to make sure I didn't pay for it." He flipped the switch, plunging the room into darkness, and walked out.
What a bitter victory. Julian's story reminds us that sometimes the opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference, it's calculation. He walked away with his fortune, but the price was the death of his romantic soul. It forces us to ask, is it better to be right and alone or to be a fool in love? If you were in Julian's shoes, would you have waited for the payout or walked away? The moment you knew, let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching. If this story made you think, please leave a like, take care of your hearts, and I'll see you in the next one.